Dr. St. John, thank you so much for joining us here on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. It's so great to meet you.
It's my pleasure. Great to meet you both as well.
Yeah, lovely. Of course, Richard here. And it was intriguing to receive some information. We just sort of discovered you through a bit of this and that and some networking, which is what we like to do. And I come across someone who's been around for a while doing things and developed your own framework and understanding of stuff. And we'll talk about the different areas that you look at. I love the general title of your book from last year, Healing the Wounds of Childhood and Culture. But I really love the overall, the overview. I had it on the top of the book, An Adventure of a Lifetime, which is so. Having given those little bits of insight there, Don, could you tell us a little bit about the Don St. John story and how you got there and how that book emerged out of you?
I would be glad to. I was conceived in 1942, just before my father was about to be shipped overseas in World War II. And my mother did not want to be a single mother, so she began thinking about abortion and then confessed to her priest, who scolded her severely, and that pretty much terminated her relationship to the Catholic Church. However, she sent me to Catholic school. But I almost died at birth. I came out, she said, with the cord wrapped around my neck and was very close to death. And then I quit. It got worse from there. And what I mean by that is, before I was 1 year old, my mother would lose her temper, like if I made a mess with my food, as an infant often does. And she'd lose it, and she'd slap me across the face in rage. And over time, it became an almost daily occurrence, and the slaps, the strikes with shoes and wooden stirring spoons, and and accompanied by epithets of rage and horrible statements of my worthlessness. And, that went on until I was big enough to physically say no. On my father's side, he was virtually a non-entity who resented me because my mother kind of used me against him, disliked him, cursed him daily. And, I pretty much dropped out of high school intellectually and emotionally on the second day of my second year, when my geometry teacher beat the living heck. I don't know what words I can use here.
That covers it. Dearie me, please keep going.
He beat him badly. He beat a young boy. I can see his face, remember his name, and that was it. I just emotionally, intellectually said no more. And I went to the public school. I took driver's ed, typing, bookkeeping. 2 days after high school, I left home, went into the Air Force, and never lived there again. So what would you predict? What kind of life would you predict someone with those beginnings having?
Don, I'm just listening. I'm thinking, now we go down this direction, and this is hell in a handbasket. You've got all the classic things of insecure attachment and confused attachment. You've got complex trauma. It got all that. But we know that life is not predetermined. It's just given dispositions. So I'm looking at you now, and I'm thinking, which part, when was he able to not go down that path? Did you go down that path straight away, or did you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, as we know people can do?
Well, the journey actually began in my fourth year in the Air Force. I was stationed in Tampa, Florida. I was drinking prodigiously.
Now that's to
And
be
one
expected. Yeah.
morning,
Okay.
of course, one morning I woke up in the back seat of my car. I was bleeding from my throat, and a little voice in my head said, "You need help." And, here I was from an Italian immigrant family. We didn't go to psychotherapists. No one in my neighborhood saw a psychotherapist. That was for crazy people. But that voice said, you
You're in the
need
back.
help.
Yeah, you're in the back seat of a car with bleeding from the throat, feeling pretty miserable. Maybe you might have been a little crazy. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, very
Yeah.
much so. Yeah, I mean, I could list the diagnoses that I would ascribe to that person. And so I found a psychotherapist who worked on Saturdays. He had great pedigree, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, MD, the whole thing. He was terrible in retrospect as a psychotherapist, but he said one thing to me that changed my life. While I was in the Air Force, I took some courses from the University of Maryland's overseas program when I was stationed in Bermuda. And I liked the psychology courses that I took. And I said to my therapist, but what would I do with a bachelor's in psychology? And he said, oh, get a PhD. And I thought to myself, you're crazy. I didn't go to high school. I'm going to get a PhD. And, that was in 1964, 65, 1967. I was at the University of Kansas in a doctoral clinical program. It was
Wow.
fast, very fast, too fast. And then the world changed, 1967, 1968. We were in a different world. I began experimenting wisely. I wasn't using drugs foolishly, but I was experimenting with LSD and psilocybin, marijuana. And I
Are you in
started
the
to
air? Are you still
realize,
in the Air Force at this point, or have you
oh,
left
no,
the Air
no,
Force?
no, no. No, I left in
Oh, you left. Yeah.
1965.
Okay.
I served 4 years and left. And I just kept putting one foot in front of the other. And at a certain point, I realized maybe I was reading Wilhelm Reich, but I realized that my body was a mess. I could not feel anything other than pain below my neck.
Mm.
Right? I lived in my mental apparatus, and that was the extent of my affect. I could get impulsive, I could get angry, but for any kind of soft feelings, completely incapable of a genuine and deep human connection. And along the way, I had many, many, many insights that kept opening up my vista of this world. And one of them was that even in what we consider to be very fine, normal homes, people emerge with issues that it would be wise for them to deal with. That perhaps, and I say perhaps, but I really believe that we're actually here to do that, that we're on this earth to emerge as whole as we can be, as fully as we can be. And, when I say that, a little voice in my head that says, are you sure you're not, as promoting narcissism here, to emerge as
Yes.
fully?
It's tricky,
And
those things,
it's,
isn't it? Yeah. So what
yeah,
what did your conclusion about that voice? Because I've certainly got some thoughts, and Matt might have too. But you found that voice was perhaps asking you the wrong question, or?
Well, my answer, Richard, to that voice is that we don't exist outside of relationship. And we simply don't. We're born in relationship. We live in relationship. One of the worst human punishments is complete isolation, right? So it's developing our capacity for relationship.
Yes, a brilliant answer. It's not the narcissism, it's not the isolation. And in fact, the isolated persona, the I have to do it on my own and I don't need anybody else, has been experimented with in various places around the world, and constantly proved itself to be inadequate and a failing. And I know Matt's got something on the tip of his tongue, but I've one of the things that I write about in the beginning of one of my first books, it was just, we have a client comes in, says, I'm not okay. And then we do stuff with them. And then they say, I'm okay now. And I think that is such an insight, because we know what is okay. We have an innate, inbuilt sense of what is okay and what is not okay. And so, of course, we seek to be okay. But we start from sometimes we start from different points. And as you say, even in what we might call a normal, well-balanced, functional home, there are always things that we need to work with and deal with. So, but gee whiz, Don, I'm just sitting here. I'll just take a breath, because that's an incredible story.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought it needed to be told, which is why
I really appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, very, very interesting. This whole thing that you discovered about the somatic self being sort of shut down and then isolating you. And Richard and I, we like making music metaphors, and
Yes,
and as you said, everything is relational, and we exist within relationship. And just as a musical note, isolated by itself is not music. It has to be in relationship with other notes and within timing and rhythm and relationship with other pitches, and so are we. So I would imagine that this then was the impetus then for expressing some of these things in your book.
Correct. Yes. And there's a very interesting misunderstanding about the body. We talk about, are you familiar with the work of Thomas Hanna? Have you ever come across that name?
Yeah, I know his name. I'm not largely familiar, but I've seen the name in amongst the various that aspect of literature.
He was a philosopher, professor of philosophy, chairman of the department at the University of Florida. And his philosophy led him to the body. And he was the person who invited Moshe Feldenkrais, a more popular name you may have heard, and to the US to teach. And he made a very important distinction about the body that I think is really valuable to recognize. He said the body has two sides. There's the outside, the body, a third person, linguistically, a third person thing, okay? I look and I can see your shoulders and I can see your forehead, and etc. However, you don't feel your forehead, you feel sensations. You feel the inner experience of your shoulders, your arms, your legs, etc., etc. And it's that we need to evolve, that we need to deepen that connection, okay, to our sensations of our body.
Yeah, and enhanced in relationship. And Richard involved in massage, as his wife is does massage. When someone else touches the forehead or the shoulder, you become more acutely aware, and that has to play a part in that, what you're saying, the second
Oh,
part of yourself.
absolutely. Absolutely. I'm a big fan of touch therapies. There's so many. And, it's like every 5 years, there seems to be another 50 or 100 new therapies out there that one can experiment with. But I think it's great that people are recognizing the importance of connecting to their body.
Because Don, I was an actor in my first incarnation, so for the first 40 years, and that's what we spent. I mean, I actually, guys, I don't want to bore everybody in the audience, but you haven't heard it before. But I actually advocate quite seriously that everybody should do, as a national service, a year of acting, where you learn to be from the inside out, and you learn to discover the presence in yourself, the capacity within yourself to be other people, to be other versions of yourself. And you experienced this. You didn't have to go and get Shakespeare to help you have this struggle. You're there in this struggle. So I just want to go back there. So to this point where you're there, you're discovering you've been cut off at the neck. And there's lots of ways and reasons why that's possible, and you seek the journey to move out of that, to engage yourself. But at this stage, when you're in that sort of frame, how lonely is that? Are you? Is that the greatest feeling of isolation or separation or disconnection that you've had? Those words just sort of come up into my, and Matt was just sort of messaging me about that.
It's a very good question, Richard. My loneliness for years in my early life, my 20s, well into my 30s, got acted out through infidelities, marriage, divorce. Okay? Without my recognition at the time that what I was seeking was genuine or heartfelt connection to another human being. And one day it happened. I was with someone and I felt this connection. What is this? It was foreign. It was strange. I knew what it was, but I never felt it before. I don't know if I felt it as an infant in my mother's arms or with my grandmother, but certainly not as an adolescent or adult. I just didn't know.
Such a huge thing, Don. I mean, when we talk, Dan Siegel in interpersonal neurobiology and various other schools of thought, but he's just got a nice simple one where he talks about the brain, the mind, the body, and relationship as just an indivisible triad. And so when you get this insecure attachment, and particularly this confused and disconnected frameworks, that relationship, going back to what I was saying about, we have a natural inbuilt system of knowing when we're okay and not okay, and not having that leaves you with this constant state of not being right. And of course, then what we do is we act out this not being in the okay state. And as you say, your acting out was seeking relationship on a sort of a superficial level, or on a sort of a shallow level, or not trusting it. All these things are really intriguing. What was going on there?
It was trying to fill a void, an emptiness. a gnawing feeling. There's something is empty that shouldn't be empty. Maybe the next, woman that I meet, something is going to fill it.
And alcohol too, was that
And
another attempt?
alcohol was part of it until my early mid-20s, and then I switched to marijuana, found it much less lethal.
Yeah.
I like music and munchies, no barroom brawls. Quite a difference.
It's a good choice.
Yeah, it was a good choice. And eventually I have to tell you, because I don't want to leave the audience without knowing that my life now at 80 years old, and my wife is also 80 years old. We've been together 38 years. The connection is extraordinary. I mean, we can go deep. We're still very much interested in exploring our sensuality, sexuality. On good days when I'm taking a walk, I feel like my body is just graceful and fluid, and the exact opposite of where it was headed in my 20s and 30s.
Isn't it amazing that your nervous system, when you're an infant and a young child, would have been developed in such a way to shut you down from connection? And yet here you are at 80, and it's completely different.
Yeah, it's a protective. Yeah, I was just saying, it's a protective thing. But that gap was still there. So, but let's talk a little bit more. So we've got this incredible picture of someone. Oh my gosh! But then you've just given us the end story, which is great. So we know what the end of the play is. Is great. Let's fill in some of that space in between. I must admit, Matt and I were both fascinated when we looked at some of the talking points that we had. Was your focus, one of your focuses of attention was on forgiveness. Can you weave that into a bit of this story of how you pieced yourself back into the wholeness of yourself now?
May I begin by telling you a little story?
Oh, please.
I was in a conference that was focused on living from the heart. It was with a man named William Brew Joy. Don't know if you heard of him. For about 15 years, he was like big in Los Angeles. He was a medical doctor, got sick. Western medicine couldn't cure him, went to India, spiritually awakened, came back, started teaching. I'm in the second day of that conference when my wife, my second wife, calls and said she had to talk to me. And she drove 2.5 hours, sat down and said, I want to have an open relationship. And oh, by the way, I started. And yeah, exactly. And you can imagine the rage, the pain. I'm 35 years old. I've been working on myself. I've made some gains, but got a ways to go. And the group was very compassionate. They focused the evening session on holding me. But the next morning, the leader came in and he said, it's time to move to the heart level. Okay. If you're not willing to do that, I'll give you a refund. You can go home, but we're not going to be hanging out at the emotional level going forward. And now I went completely crazy. I was bouncing off the walls. I was punching things. It was unimaginable. How do you do that? How could you possibly do that? Yeah. And I had until 6 that evening to make a choice: take the refund, go home, or let go of all the emotional stuff, right? Sounds crazy, I know, but hang in there with me. Well, this went on all day, all afternoon, I should say. when somewhere around 5 in the evening, out of the blue, all of a sudden, I swear to you, my heart just like it opened and I felt love.
Wow.
For no one in particular, for no reason in particular, I felt this love. I thought, oh my God. And a delight that came over me. Well, of course I'll stay. Of course, we'll go to the heart. Now, the rage and the pain did not go away. They emerged throughout the next few days, but the context was different. The context had shifted. She wasn't doing it to me. It was like, okay, this is what's happening. We'll see if we're going to stay together or not stay together. But some magical things started happening to me in the group. I could see my future. I could see that it was going to go in a positive direction.
In retrospect, what created that moment of shift? If you could put your finger on anything, maybe you can't.
Possibly the intention of the leader, who presumably was functioning out of that heart space, had achieved that in his own spiritual quest.
Yeah, and that sense of if we do have this, that moving into the heart space is the better thing for us, and of course any system will want to move itself towards what's better for it, but discovering and I talk about therapy, but when I talk about it, a lot of what we're doing is creating opportunities and appropriate circumstances. And that sort of rather ambiguous comment is really what this chap did. He created an opportunity by having the conference. He created some circumstances, which certainly was stay or go. But as you say, he created the conditions by his presence. So it is often just with a therapist that it is not necessarily what they do. It's just who they are. It's the being, the relational being that you create in between therapy in the therapeutic process.
Agree.
Yeah.
And Richard, that takes me to where we started, which is forgiveness. And forgiveness is essential to open the heart, to be able to live with peace and love in your heart, because, it's easy to compile and accumulate resentments, rancor, regrets, and forgiving ourselves for the things we did or didn't do or wish we had done. And, to have that attitude, and to be honest about the things we've done to others, and to feel, there's pain when we look and see that we were unconscious and it hurt someone,
Yeah. And when we talk about forgiveness, we obviously, we can't control anybody else. So this is purely, our own thing that we have to do and reconcile in our own hearts. Can you, because it's very difficult, I think, for many to forgive when the attitude or the abuse or whatever is unchanging in the other.
Just before you answer, John, I'll just add a comment, a thought of mine and my experience, and then please, if you would comment, because I'm just, as you're saying that, Matt, there's somebody else. Like, I've got a very unpleasant interaction with a person. I don't actually have any desire to forgive him. He was a horrible person. But I forgive me for making the mistake, for not seeing it. I go, okay. And I kind of forgive myself for getting sucked. It was a fraud case. So I forgive myself for being sucked into it. And and part of my forgiveness was that I needed to learn. So I said, to forgive myself, I need to learn from this and become better. So forgiveness sometimes is different, and it's interesting what you said, Matt. Don, please, love to hear your reflections.
Well, it's ironic that you brought up fraud. My wife and I were just scammed this past week for a good sum of money by some real pros. You know, if the abuse is current and continuous, obviously it has to be stopped, right? Is that what you're talking about, Matt?
Well, even if you've escaped the abuse, but the abuser is out there and unchanged, you know, I've had some, you know, fraudulent things happen to me as well, and the individuals are, you know, still out there, probably, you know, scamming others. Yeah.
Well, I think one thing that's important is that the anger that comes from that doesn't fester in one's heart. You know, if it's playing in our minds, that no good SOB, and next time I see him, I'm going, you know, to keep that quality of energy inside of us doesn't help us, right?
Yeah,
I
we
mean,
kind
to
of
do what we have to do, what we have to do to take care of ourselves, to not allow it to happen, to put them in jail, to, you know, to bring forth strength. That's different, and that's important. But, you know, I know people, I mean, my family, I mean, they get mad at somebody and they stay mad for 12 years, you know, and then every time the name comes up, you know, the affect, the stories, who does that help? And then 12 years later, all of a sudden they're invited to dinner and the feud's over. It's bizarre. As a kid, I couldn't understand it. You know?
Oh,
You
yeah.
talked to them for 7 years. Now they come over every Friday night. What happened?
Yeah, because so there's several levels of this. I mean, one is the letting go of the person, just saying, okay, you're a bad person, that's it, but you no longer are affecting me. I forgive myself for being in that connection. And then there's this other thing of actually even holding on. And I suppose maybe people hold on because they hope the relationship will resolve, and then that possibility, and as you say, quite bizarre sometimes, where resolution is possible. So, but it's how do we manage the holding on? So the letting go, that's probably easier to do, but the holding on, when it's done by festering and by, you know, maintaining that anger and that rage, is only going to leave you, well, you know, maybe end you up in the back of a car bleeding from your throat, you know. So it's not good. Yeah.
Right. We've all been wounded. And the process of healing these wounds, the process of becoming whole, becomes an adventure in that we face challenges, surprises, things that are unexpected, amazing rewards along the way. And as far as I can tell, there's no end to it as long as we're breathing. And there are 4 areas that I think it's important to address. And these 4 areas are the body, the soma, as we've just spoken of, our psychology, you know, the purview of the psychotherapist. I think everyone needs to be in a good relationship, somewhere where your authentic self feels safe to emerge, to be seen, to be revealed. And if you don't have that in your life, find it with a psychotherapist, because it's hard to affect, okay, because of that tension between authenticity and attachment. From the very beginning, that tension that's there. And if our authenticity isn't supported, it gets tucked away, it gets disowned. Those parts of me that are not me. And then I project them onto someone else, et cetera, et cetera. So that whole process. And I think relationship work, working in relationship is a whole area. I separated it from the psychological because I believe it warrants in and of itself a whole lot of attention and emphasis. Okay? I mean, I can't tell you, I've been taking workshops both personally and professionally for 40 years or more. Mm-hmm. And the last one is the whole spiritual dimension. Okay. I would just encourage people to embark on the adventure because it's worthwhile.
What a beautiful, simple statement. I love it. I love it. And I'm going to keep doing that myself.
Fantastic.
Good.
Dr. Don St. John, thank you so much for joining us here on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. It was great getting to know you.
It's my pleasure. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Hey, take care.